January 17th, 1944, Camp Forest, Tennessee. The transport train groaned to a halt beneath a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon. 63 German prisoners, still wearing the dust of North African defeat, pressed their faces against the slatted windows. They had crossed an ocean in the belly of a Liberty ship, their stomachs churning with seawater and dread, expecting transfer to another circle of hell. Instead, what met their eyes was farmland, endless, impossibly green farmland, rolling under winter sun like an ocean of its own. The air, when the doors finally opened, carried no stench of cordite or decay. It smelled of pine and wet earth and something else they couldn't name, normalcy. These men had been told many things, that America was a mongrel nation on the brink of collapse, that its cities teemed with unemployed masses, its armies equipped with inferior weapons, its people soft from decadence and racial impurity. Obersturmführer Werner Kleist, a veteran of Rommel's Afrika Korps, had repeated these lessons to his men even as British artillery shattered their positions at El Alamein. Now, stepping onto American soil for the first time, Kleist felt the first hairline fracture in the ideology that had shaped his adult life. The guards who met them carried rifles, yes, but their uniforms were clean, their faces untroubled by hunger. One of them was chewing something, gum, Kleist would later learn, his jaw working with the casual rhythm of a man who had never questioned where his next meal would come from. The German prisoners had spent 3 years fighting in a war that promised them living space in the east and glory for the fatherland. They had endured the freezing steppes of Russia where men's fingers turned black and fell off like burnt matchsticks. They had choked on desert sand in Libya while British tanks circled their positions like mechanical wolves. They had watched their rations dwindle from bread and sausage to sawdust biscuits and ersatz coffee made from acorns. In the final months before their capture, a single tin of meat had been divided among 8 men, and they had licked the metal clean. This was total war. This was sacrifice for the greater good. This, they had been told, was what it meant to be a soldier of the Reich. Camp Forest was not what they expected. The compound sprawled across 500 acres of Tennessee woodland, surrounded by chain-link fencing, topped not with barbed wire but with simple mesh. Guard towers stood at the corners, but the men inside them seemed more interested in magazines than in the prisoners below. The barracks, when the Germans were marched to them, were not the dank cellars or crowded pens they had imagined. They were wooden buildings with windows that opened, with stoves that worked, with bunks that came 2 to a frame instead of 10 to a room. Each man received blankets, 2 blankets, thick and clean-smelling, without lice. Feldwebel Hans Decker, who had slept in a frozen foxhole outside Stalingrad with only a threadbare coat for warmth, sat on his assigned bunk and ran his hands over the wool. His throat tightened. He did not cry. He had not cried since his brother died at Kursk, but something inside him shifted like ice beginning to thaw. That first evening, the prisoners were led to the mess hall. They entered in silence, their bodies tensed for disappointment, for the thin gruel and stale bread that had defined their last months of freedom. What they found instead was a line, a cafeteria line like something from a peacetime university, where American soldiers in aprons served food onto metal trays. Not 1 item, not 2, but portions of roast beef, boiled potatoes, green beans, fresh bread with butter, and a slice of apple pie. Kleist stood frozen, his tray growing heavy in his hands. Behind him, a young private named Josef Baumann began to shake. "Es ist eine Falle," he whispered. "It's a trap. They're fattening us for something." But there was no trap. The food was real, the quantities were real. And this, they would learn, was not an exceptional day. This was Tuesday. According to the records of the War Department, the United States held over 371,000 Axis prisoners on American soil by the end of 1944, the majority of them German. The Geneva Convention stipulated that prisoners of war were to receive rations equivalent to those of the captor nation's base troops. American-based troops, even in wartime, ate better than most civilian populations in Europe. The U.S. military supply chain, uninterrupted by bombing raids or submarine warfare on the home front, functioned with mechanical efficiency. Refrigerated railcars brought meat from Chicago, wheat poured from the Midwest in quantities that would have fed a small European nation. Sugar, coffee, milk, butter, commodities that had vanished from German grocery shelves by 1942, arrived at prisoner-of-war camps in Tennessee and Texas and Oklahoma with the regularity of sunrise. The prisoners ate. And as they ate, something fundamental began to erode. Werner Kleist had joined the Hitler Youth at age 10. He had marched in torchlight parades through Munich, had sung the Horst Wessel-Lied with the fervor of the converted, had believed with the certainty of the young that Germany's destiny was to reshape the world. The Führer had promised them that National Socialism would create a new order, one where the strong thrived and the weak were swept aside, where German discipline and racial purity would triumph over the chaotic democracies of the West. Kleist had seen the photographs in Der Stürmer, caricatures of Americans as lazy, race-mixed degenerates, their country ruled by Jewish financiers and Negro jazz musicians. And yet, here in this camp in Tennessee, the guards were neither cruel nor weak. They were simply indifferent in a way that suggested they had better things to think about. They did their shifts and went home. They did not seem to carry the weight of a 1,000-year ideology on their shoulders. The days took on a rhythm. Roll call at dawn, work details, clearing brush, repairing roads, helping with the harvest on nearby farms. The labor was real but not punishing. The Geneva Convention prohibited the use of prisoners for war production, so the men built furniture, tended gardens, constructed recreational facilities for the camp itself. They were paid, too, 80 cents per day in scrip that could be spent at the camp canteen. The canteen sold Coca-Cola, chocolate bars, cigarettes, toothpaste, and writing paper. Josef Baumann bought a Hershey's bar his first week and ate it in his bunk after lights out, the sweetness so intense it made his teeth ache. He had not tasted chocolate in 2 years. On Sundays there was no work. The prisoners could attend church services, Catholic or Protestant as they chose, or spend the day reading, playing chess, organizing soccer matches on the recreation field. A small library was established stocked with German-language books donated by the Red Cross. Kleist found a copy of Goethe's Faust and read it cover to cover, reacquainting himself with a version of German culture that had nothing to do with blood and soil. There were no propaganda films here, no mandatory political lectures. The Americans, it seemed, did not particularly care what the prisoners thought as long as they followed the rules. This indifference was, in its way, more subversive than any re-education program could have been. Hans Decker wrote a letter to his wife in Hamburg. The censors would read it, he knew, but he wrote it anyway. "The food here is better than what we had before the war," he told her. "I have gained weight. I am warm at night. Sometimes I forget that I am a prisoner." He paused, his pencil hovering over the paper, aware that he was confessing something shameful. But it was true. In the camp, he did not wake at 3 a.m. to the scream of incoming artillery. He did not watch his friends bleed out in the snow. He did not go to bed hungry. The irony was inescapable. He was more free in this American prison than he had been in the Wehrmacht. Not all the prisoners accepted this reality easily. There were hardliners in the camp, men who still believed in the final victory, who whispered that the new wonder weapons would turn the tide, who saw collaboration with the Americans as treason. They formed cliques, enforced their own brutal discipline, threatened those who spoke too openly of their doubts. A prisoner named Otto Fischer, who had been overheard saying he hoped Germany would lose the war so the killing would end, was found beaten in the latrine. The camp authorities separated the factions after that, moving the die-hard Nazis to different compounds. But the cracks were widening. Every meal, every warm night, every casual kindness from a guard chipped away at the edifice of certainty. In December 1944, the prisoners were served turkey for Christmas. Real turkey, roasted until the skin crackled, with stuffing and cranberry sauce and mashed potatoes heaped high enough to spill over the edges of the tray. Kleist sat at the long table in the mess hall, surrounded by men who had once been ready to die for the Reich, and watched them eat in silence. Some wept, others laughed, harsh, desperate laughter that had nothing to do with joy. One man stood up and walked out, unable to reconcile the absurdity of it all. Kleist stayed. He ate slowly, tasting each bite, and thought about the Russian villages he had helped burn, the food his unit had confiscated from starving civilians, the logic of total war that had made such actions seem necessary. He had been told that cruelty was strength, that mercy was weakness, that Germany's survival depended on the annihilation of its enemies, but his enemies had given him Turkey. The official reports from the Office of the Provost Marshal General noted that escape attempts from American POW camps were rare and recaptures swift. Of the few Germans who did attempt to flee, many turned themselves back in within days, unable to navigate a country so vast and so foreign, or simply unwilling to return to the hunger and chaos of a collapsing Reich. Some prisoners requested to remain in the United States after the war. They had tasted abundance, and the taste had changed them. Werner Kleist was repatriated to Germany in 1946. He returned to a country of ruins. Berlin was a graveyard of shattered buildings and hollow-eyed survivors. There was no food, there was no fuel. The black market traded in cigarettes and stolen rations. Kleist stood in the rubble of what had once been his childhood home and thought about Tennessee. He thought about the green fields and the clean barracks and the mess hall where the trays never came back empty. He thought about the American guards who had treated him not as a subhuman enemy, but as a problem to be managed with bureaucratic efficiency. It had not been kindness exactly, it had been something more powerful, indifference born of abundance. The Americans had fed their prisoners well, not because they loved them, but because they could, because their system produced so much that even the defeated could be given a share. This, Kleist realized, was the true weapon. Not the Sherman tanks or the P-51 Mustangs or the atomic bombs. The true weapon was the simple, staggering fact that America had enough. Enough food, enough resources, enough confidence in its own ideology that it did not need to starve its captives to feel strong. The Reich had preached sacrifice and discipline and the nobility of suffering. America had responded with 3 meals a day and clean sheets. And in that contrast, the entire architecture of Kleist's beliefs had collapsed like a bombed-out cathedral. The prisoners of war who returned to Germany carried with them something more dangerous than any military intelligence. They carried the memory of a bold, different world. They told their families, their neighbors, their children, "We were prisoners, and we ate better than you do now." They spoke of camps where the lights worked, and the medicine was real, and the guards did not beat you for the pleasure of it. Some were accused of exaggeration, of collaboration, of having been brainwashed by American propaganda, but the truth was simpler and more devastating. They had seen what a functioning democracy looked like when it turned its industrial might to the machinery of war. They had been fed by the enemy, and the meal had been more filling than any ideology. In the end, it was not bullets that defeated the idea of the 1,000-year Reich. It was butter, it was bread, it was the quiet, unshakable reality of a system that could wage total war and still have enough left over to be humane. The German prisoners who sat in the camps of Tennessee and Texas and Oklahoma learned this lesson in the most visceral way possible. Through their bodies, which grew strong again, through their minds, which had time to think without the drumbeat of propaganda, through their hearts, which softened in the absence of fear. When Werner Kleist died in 1989, weeks before the Berlin Wall fell, his grandchildren found among his possessions a small, battered notebook. Inside, in faded pencil, was a single sentence written over and over in English, phonetic and misspelled, practiced until the letters were smooth. "Thank you for the meal." He had never explained what it meant, but those who knew his story understood. It was not gratitude exactly. It was acknowledgement. A recognition that he had been wrong about everything that mattered and that the truth had been served to him on a metal tray in a camp in Tennessee, one ordinary Tuesday in 1944, when the enemy gave him more than his own country ever had.